Great to be here, and thanks to the organizers for having this panel. Really excited to get into the conversation. We have a really diverse, great panel today to talk about this topic. We have government perspective, investor perspective, entrepreneur, business perspective, to talk about the importance of resilience and adaptation, as well as some of the challenges and some of the opportunities in rural communities and in agriculture specifically. So really excited to get into it. We have about an hour, and we want to make some time for audience Q&A. So as you listen to the panelists talk, if you have questions, keep them in your mind, and we'll make sure there's some time to ask your questions to the panelists directly. So my first question is to each of you, if you can just give a brief introduction of who you are, why you're on this panel, what brought you to this point, and what adaptation and resilience means to you. We'll start.
Hi, my name is Cedric. I'm CEO and co-founder of Entosystem. So first, thank you very much to be here. Thanks to FCC. So I guess the reason that Entosystem is here is we're talking about adaptation. So we're trying to adapt the food cycle. So most of it right now, we're in Canada, we're one of the worst countries in terms of food waste. So nearly 60% of the food production is waste. So on the other side, we're importing a lot of protein and fertilizer from overseas. So we're trying to close the gap. So Entosystem, exactly what we do is take food waste from grocery stores and give it to insects, and then the insects are dry and serve as protein to feed our animal. And everything left in the bin is their manure, is sold as organic fertilizer. So we're basically taking a waste from food waste and transforming it into product in a zero waste facility. That's pretty much it.
Thank you so much. Allison, would you like to introduce yourself?
So Montreal, wow, this is like, this is an incredible crowd, and what a wonderful venue. I started out life as an entrepreneur, and I built my business from a garage and took it around the world. And it basically, I developed a data acquisition and analytics platform that reduced emissions but improved profitability on ranch and farm. And it also improved animal health. I actually never really thought about emissions when I first started out. As time went on, it became more and more important to me. I divested my business in 2019. I owned 90% of my business when I divested it to a UK private wealth firm, and it's not a good story. I mean, it was a great exit, but the story is really, I couldn't find funding, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have in terms of developing new technology. I founded the Creative Destruction Lab, great labs out of the University of Montreal, in Montreal HEC, and also started thinking that the things that I needed was mentorship. The second thing that I needed was capital, access to capital. And I'm going to keep emphasizing that as we go through this conversation today, because access to capital is what is limiting climate adaptation, resiliency in farms. And it's not about the technology per se, but it's more about access to capital and ability to change. The second thing that I'd really like to get across today is agriculture is our most incredible opportunity to change climate and also to respond to the challenges that climate poses to agriculture. So that will be the focus of the conversation today. Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Allison. Justine.
So Justine Hendricks, I'm the CEO of Farm Credit Canada, so I guess the government side of things for this panel. But for those of you that might not know us in the crowd, we're a Financial Crown Corporation. We've been around for 65 years. So we literally eat, breathe every single day ag and food. We have about a branch network of 100 branches across Canada, 100,000 customers, and an overall book that's valued at about $65 billion. So really dedicated 100% to this great industry. I had the pleasure of being on this stage last year, and one of the closing questions was, what's the message to the financiers or the crowd here was, well, one, if you think of opportunities in terms of where to invest, as Allison says, ag and food, if you take just the manufacturing sector in Canada, it is the number one most important sector for manufacturing is ag and food. And when you look at the investment flows going into this sector, it's amongst the lowest. So as a financier, what we're looking to bring to the table is to support Cédric as he's working through his inventions and trying to figure out how to adapt. We're also not just a bank, but we're also an investor. We have a software platform that we can talk about later in terms of how do you measure as you're adapting. And the other piece I think Allison's talked about is that advice, right? The advice that you need at different stages along the way of your journey. And we really believe that it's the combination of those four that folks in this sector need in order to put their best foot forward.
Thanks so much, Allison. Jeffrey.
Tanchi Ani Bojo, folks. My name is Jeff Sear. My traditional name is Eagle Man Leading. I think I'm the black sheep on the panel. I'm just cluing into that. I'm an Indigenous impact investor and started a venture capital firm, raised a couple of funds investing into Indigenous venture capital, and particularly into enterprises. But more recently, over the last couple of years, wanted to focus more on well-being at the community level and investing in the upliftment of Indigenous people. We started something called Raven Indigenous Outcomes Fund. And here's, I think, where thematically I connect with my colleagues on the panel, where we invest in innovative financial products, which we call outcomes-based financing, and bring those products into community to solve complex problems at the community level, with the community leading the problem that's to be solved and how the investment should be structured. What a lot of finance folks in the room would know as community-led investing. So really at the core of that work. You invested in one of my early funds. You probably don't know that, one of the first Raven funds. And so do a lot of different work in this space, but really here, and at the core of the question of this opening question is the why. Why? Because we can do a lot better than we have been doing for Indigenous people in this country. They're at the forefront of climate change and climate adaptation. And a lot of our work focuses on adapting to that climate at a local level where you build resilience to last through what I call shocks to the system, of which we've seen an increasing both frequency and amount over time. So I'll pause there and we can get into it. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for giving the audience a sense of who you are and what you bring to the conversation. The first question I'd like to start with, some of you touched on it, but I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what the stakes are. So why this conversation is important, why resilience, particularly in agriculture and in rural communities, is so important, what the impacts of climate change are on the agriculture sector, and why we really need to see more finance being mobilized to help find solutions. I think there's not so much now, but in recent years has been this misperception that maybe Canada might come out ahead with climate change, and agriculture is spoken about a lot. You know, you hear about, well, there will be a longer growing season and more regions of the country will be amenable to agriculture, and it's sort of left at that, and of course the reality is much more complicated. So yeah, I'll just open it up, and if anyone wants to speak to what are the stakes, what does it look like if we don't get this right, if we don't adapt successfully, particularly in agriculture.
So the stakes are very real, and there was a moment, and it's if you think about it, we are 4 days away from anarchy if we lose our food. And it's very real if our supply chains break down. In Western Canada, we had absolutely no peaches because we had such a severe storm that it took out the trees. We've seen vineyards. If you want to see something very close, we may lose our wine crops, smoke. All of the things that climate change brings to farms are very real. If we look at 2013 to 2023, we actually had climate impact that was about $700,000 up to $7 million. In 2024, we had the greatest impact from climate that Canada has ever seen. And we had $8 billion of losses due to climate. So as we've seen that trend start increasing, if you think about where does your next meal come from, it's very, very important.
So maybe I'll pick up from that because what you're saying, Allison, and if I take last year as an example, so when there is a client event, right, typically FCC will come to the table and we immediately reach out to our customers to see what we can do. And often the best thing you can do to support them in their moment of demonstrating that resiliency is not to abandon them, right? And that needs to be quite customized, whether you're peaches, wine, cattle, or canola, it's different for every one of them. So first things first is recognizing the uniqueness of the subsectors and then making sure that you can adapt to that is often something we forget. The second thing I would say is when Allison says, like, the stakes are real, the risks are real, but also think of the opportunity, and that's even bigger. So the stakes we talk about is losing your economic opportunity, 4 days away from, anarchy, losing Canada's competitiveness, which, if we're frank with each other, is dropping, right? But from an opportunity point of view, in terms of what you can do if you can support this sector as it weathers those different patterns, and I would say that sometimes one of the mistakes we do in a financing world is we kind of assume we know, so we bring kind of the savviness of the sophistication of some of these structures, but the person we talk to last is Cédric. And it's probably the person we should speak to first, because as the entrepreneur, he's had to start from the idea, from not really being sure and having a concept, having to live through the ups and downs, trying to get his financing, and then getting that shock that he has to navigate. So that, to me, is what is super important. And then as a result of that, I think if I put my government financier hat, is how can we come to the table, and for us is to be that catalyst. So whether we're on this stage because we bring the different views together, whether we bring a community of financiers and really be able to put the cards on the table to set ourselves and be willing to be creative in how we tackle it, to not always come at it the way we've done before, because that's what's going to get us to those opportunities that we desperately need to grasp.
Yeah, so I'm going to take I don't mean to be dramatic. I'll take an approach to it from we're hands-on into rural communities, Indigenous communities, really bumping from crisis to crisis a lot of the times. And it's our fault in Canada how we've structured these things for our communities. But what's at stake is essentially lives, frankly, and then livability of those lives, like how good those lives are on a day-to-day basis, whether you have food, whether you can resist a forest fire, or a grass fire, as it was last week in a community we invested in. They lost a couple of houses to a grass fire. It's 29 degrees in the prairies right now, and it's unusually dry and unusually hot. It affects crops, but affects people's lives at the same time. So there's that aspect that's raw and it's real, and we're hands-on as investors. We're in there all the time. We're doing that, listening to what the community needs. It's super important. There's also something else going on, and I think you touched on it, which is we're having shocks to the undercurrents of the Canadian economy at the same time by not adapting properly. In particular, you're seeing it sort of residual effects coming into these industries post facto. For example, the insurance industry is increasingly ratcheting up their costs and seeing exactly, you try to get some fire and flood insurance nowadays and see what it's like. In the US, you try to get auto insurance and see what it's like. There's systemic changes going on which we're not doing well to adapt to in an era where we're facing, and we will continue to face, climate pressures. In Indigenous communities, this comes down to how you heat your house and, whether you've got good airflow, can you get medical services or not. Most of the time it's not, by the way. And so what we talk about, or what we're trying to do with our investments, is build the resilience in the community. So a COVID shock, a financial crisis comes along, and now a tariff, form of a tariff crisis, I think I'll use those words, and it's having latent impacts. They sort of trickle a bit slower, but as government agencies and as entrepreneurs and as investors, we need to be on the front line of adaptation. And we need to find ways to get to the ground and adapt. Out of ivory towers, down on the ground, how does this really work so those communities can sustain their resilience over time? So that's what I think is at stake.
Thanks so much. Matt, anything?
I'll bring a more personal, maybe, perspective on the subject. Well, 10 years ago when I started my company was not, raising insects in a condo, it's not because I was enjoying grubs in my kitchen. It was really a question about, learning about all the issue around food and the fish meal. So over the world, we're overfishing our ocean. It's around 7 million of fish meal that we're extracting from the ocean. And what we realized is that at one point, we won't have any fish left in the ocean. So right now, you already have community that depend on those fish that we're overfishing. And just as we overfish every year, the stock population are not reproducing fast enough to repopulate the ocean. So that's where Entosystem came in, because every tons of protein that we're going to produce, well, it's 1 ton of fish that we can leave in the ocean. So having support of the financing institution back in the days really make it credible, because at that point I was the crazy guy with fly, but right now we're producing maybe 1,000 tons this year of protein. Well, it's somewhere in the food chain, 1,000 tons of fish that we can leave in the ocean. So for me, it was really important enough to quit my job and start raising insects.
Thanks so much for that. So we've talked about some of the stakes, why this matters, but you also, all of you are working hands-on in different aspects of finding solutions, whether it's starting a company, financing, working with the private sector to make sure that government is supporting resilience across the agriculture sector. So want to talk a little bit about what good things are starting to happen. We can talk more about what the barriers are and what we need to see, but just from your personal experience, really working in this field, what are you seeing that's seeing some success? What do you think we need to see more of? How can the government and the private sector work together more effectively to address some of the challenges that we're seeing and really scale some of the solutions that we know have promise? So I'll just open it up. Jeff?
I'll give it
Yeah?
a first shot from my perspective. So where I see great hope, I think, is a trend towards an attitude change from the finance industry itself. It's essentially a finance conference. Let's talk about finance. Where there is a growing understanding that what we're doing now in terms of how finance is structured and how we're bringing this forward to investments either in other funds or intermediaries or directly into investments on the ground isn't really working. We're not being productive enough, we're not doing it fast enough, we're probably not always investing in the right thing, and we're not encouraging enough of the innovation and productivity that we need to see in the country. Blended finance, in my opinion, which is an area I work in, has a lot of potential. And here I talk blended finance in a more broad-based way. I talk about public capital, meeting private capital, and philanthropic capital. We can talk about what things need to change with that, but what's happening is there's more of a willingness to move forward. Key in that is every part of that ecosystem plays a very key niche role. I mean, the government comes with large dollars, can be catalytic in its nature by getting behind, a whole sector or a whole different way of investing in a bulk way. As long as we're not too stuck in our silos about what that investment should look like, we need to kind of get out of those silos about, it has to return this and be structured this way, and I need to understand it, and I need to work with it before. We need to be more creative. Philanthropy comes in on the side of it, says, there's a capacity build that needs to happen before that investment could actually be accepted and can be underwritten and can happen in a right way. So there is hope here that I think things are moving in the right direction, and we've had some success. We're not very large yet, but we've had some success in moving those into working together and being a little more open-minded about how capital shows up, how it's needed on the ground for folks like Cedric and people doing stuff on the ground.
Thanks.
Well, I think we have to be more brutally economic. The The returns from investing in agriculture and innovation for Canada are immense. I think we have to demonstrate what that economic opportunity is. It's massive. If we converted to an insect protein, that would create a whole new market. 8 trillion. I'm losing my billions. 8 trillion is the economic activity possibility from investing in technologies. Ag biotech, amazing. The protein that we currently grow on massive amounts of land, as demonstrated by Cedric. If we look at automation on farm, I went to a wonderful Quebec company today that is creating large machines that operate, reduce weeds, improve farmer profitability substantially, and are reducing emissions. If we think about how we can use technology to drive change, investors will come. And I actually think that that's how we have to think about it. We can do good, we can make money, and we can do good, but we can also ensure resiliency and future food security. So I think we have to look at people like Cedric, who are really taking the forefront of this, and think about how exciting this opportunity actually is.
Yeah, my name is Drop a lot. I really have got a great team, but yeah, I'm here today, but it's really a team effort. And I would say something really important about financing. I want to emphasize the stage of the company. And I think, having the sustainability aspect in our project make the difference because, and I'll take the example of FCC here. I was barely out of the kitchen when we started the first discussion. And I think it's the aspect of sustainability, the fact that they understand food waste, the need for protein and fertilizer, that they really invest in the company really early stage. So they enter the Death Valley with us. They were not waiting at the end of the Death Valley, then when you go out and they welcome you. So having partners with that much credibility bring the BDC, the EQ, and the Desjardins that can bring to the table. And we really need those partners to be able to build what we're aiming to do. So, well, thank you. But yeah, going early stage is really important. Having a leader that trusts the vision, make the difference.
So maybe two things I'll add. One, I remember when you and I met, I was very early in my mandate, and I asked you along when we were walking through all your facilities. I said, hey, Cedric, I said, all of this thing around sustainability, and, because you made it pretty clear to me that from day one, that was always at the core of everything you planned for, right? Which is a different mindset than those that have been in business for a while. So I said, okay, Cedric, give me the straight goods. This is all good. We all know theoretically that you should do it, but is it really worth it? I don't know if you remember what you told me. Do you remember?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll remind you what you told me. And you said, Justine, I know that at the beginning, it's a much bigger investment. And at the time, I don't know if it's still true, you literally said to me, I have 4 or 5 people full-time trying to find different grants to keep you going. Yep. So that's a plug for us to come in early to support. But you said, I know that I'm going to leapfrog over my competition. I'd like to suggest that you're right in the process of doing that right now. So your strategy of bringing that from day one and incorporating it is paying off. And it's not to say that there aren't any ups and downs. So kudos to you. Because that was super inspirational. But maybe the extra point I want to bring to the table on, when you're asking what are the different ways you can do it. One of the things we talk about at FCC is we basically go out there and say ag and food needs all of us. And when I say all of us, it includes everybody in this room. It's not just those of us that are knee-deep in the sector, but it's others to come to the table to be able to come with the creative solutions. One of the things we've been noticing in the last couple of years, and it's actually less on the financing side, but I consider it an important lever, we've been working with some of the key associations to create some incentive programs where some of the producers sign up for what we recognize as the best practices. If they're an FCC customer, we'll actually refund a portion of their interest to reward for those best practices, and we're able to track how they're doing against that. And what was super fascinating this past year, and we did one with Dairy Farmers of Canada, the phone rang at FCC, and the buyer that called us was Starbucks. And Starbucks realized and they said, hey, if you guys have a first way in and you can create that incentive, they have a choice. They can go and create their own incentive and say there'll be the Starbucks program, the FCC program. But they picked up to say if we add on and create this lever effect on top of FCC, it's going to become more meaningful for those that are benefiting from them. And then we start to kind of bring everybody together. So that lever effect, whether you do it in your financing structure in different ways, I think is super important for all of us that are actors in this world, because it is complex. There's so many people that are trying to find a solution, and we're not spending enough time actually coming together to come up with solutions that can be simpler for Cedric and others. So I'd add that that's an important component too. Did you realize that the whole panel was going to be about you?
No, didn't knew that.
That's good, that's good.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to audience questions. So please think about questions you might want to ask our panelists, and we'll get there in a few minutes. Wanted to ask, Justine, you just, I think, maybe touched on some of the answer to this question, but just to follow up, so we hear about these good stories that are happening, the promise, the economic return for adaptation, particularly in agriculture, how significant it is, but we also know that there's a financing gap, that we're not seeing the flows that we need to see to really scale these solutions and build resilience more effectively. And this financing gap exists in adaptation more broadly across the country. We talk about it a lot in terms of infrastructure, but we know it's also the case with agriculture. So what are some of the barriers that are holding us back, particularly some of those more systemic barriers? What are some of the solutions you'd like to see, whether at the policy level or changes in the finance ecosystem, or how companies operate to help build on some of these success stories, but really scale them to be more effective across the country? Who wants to take a first crack at that?
I will. I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian view. I don't think we do anyone favors by making our Canadian inventors grantpreneurs. I think we have to understand that the solutions we build must be economically driven, and there is a two-part to that. It can also be sustainable and environmentally friendly. Now, if you want to know what levers we have to pull, there are so many financial levers that we could pull and that you could incentivize if you're a climate investor or any investor. And agriculture uses 30% of the world's energy. It creates so many greenhouse gas, but we have the opportunity to be a responsive mechanism. Things like green bonds, municipal bonds, FCC's programs to pay for principles and services. But where you can really drive change is as a consumer. You are a purchaser of products that could be greener, could be more sustainable. And so when you're looking at your food products, demand this. That creates the economic engine that can pay for these innovations.
So I can piggyback off of Allison and add two things. So one, the closer you get to the farm, I think one of the things that's super important for us to remember is one season, one chance, okay? Yeah. And that's really important when we're expecting new technologies to come into place. The risk that I'll say the producer, the farmer bears in terms of trying to get that return or making it work is significant. Second thing is, and back to where we started the conversation about, we tend to talk about this, about the rural reality versus the urban reality. I would suggest to all of you that urban reality doesn't survive without the rural communities contributing back to the food. And we tend to forget that, right? So it becomes kind of down on our list. The third thing when you talk about a real barrier is, there's interprovincial trade, there's trade infrastructure, but another need that's out there is broadband. So if you want to bring all these technologies to rural communities, I think that the last stat I have, I think, is we're still at almost 60% of rural communities in Canada have access to broadband, but think of the 40% that don't. And if you want to bring technology for adaptability and so forth, you will need that in order to leapfrog over. And those would be just kind of some of the examples that we have to consider. And I think for all of us, as we're looking at this, whether you're Raven or Allison in terms of her investment choices, how Cédric decides to lean into technology, is to be willing to look at it differently. So I've got customers that tell me, Justine, I'm a farmer today, but I believe I'm the future energy company. And now those are some of the thinking we need to bring to the table and to then bring along the finance sector to be able to help resolve those things.
Yeah, I'm going to play off some
Go
of
for
yours
it.
if I can. Wow, there's lots to say on this topic. What are the barriers? What do you need to change to get to scale? One of the things I would say is, I'm going to talk about a couple ways, the way that finance shows up and the way that finance thinks about these sorts of investment, in my experience of being an investor and raising capital from the private capital system and the government system. So one, the grantrepreneur system is a terrible way to be. It's not a good use of time. When we started, we were running around looking at grants, and I think the technical term, it's a real pain in the ass. It's got low reward and a lot of work to get it there. I think coordination, harmonization, and how granting is done, a little bit more open-mindedness. Philanthropy can also play a role. Again, they can be organized, and I think they want to be organized in that system. But from a point of view of a philosophy, I mean, when we talk about investing and putting capital in people, wow, what's the return? My argument that is, how much return is a return that you actually need? What sort of profit level? When you start to look at the outcome or the impact of not acting on that problem situation. So the risk-reward profile, which you always see as investors, gets a little bit topsy-turvy. You're not thinking about it in quite the right way if you want to build resilience. In my experience, risk is almost always perceived risk. Very rarely do you get into the hardcore due diligence where you're looking at companies' finances. Most of the time is, well, this is new, so I don't know it, so I'm not going to invest in it. Which, in my experience, almost all investing is character-based investing. I met Cédric, I like Cédric, I trust Cédric, I've seen his thing, and this is how you build your due diligence. This is what we do with Indigenous communities who struggle, multiple crises. Not a lot of people, there's lots of capacity and smart people, but they're busy doing a whole bunch of other things. So trying to build the capacity in that space. So looking at risk differently. And I'll talk to a big bank and they'll say, well, look, it doesn't fit our investment profile for our fund. And I'm like, then change your investment profile. Let's get honest here about what we need to do if we're going to drive change. I believe in profitability, but I believe some of these investments can be ultra stable, ultra low risk, and give all kinds of rewards. And then you change people from being farmers to energy companies. And you change Indigenous communities from being a draw on an ecosystem to giving back. They're producing energy, you're training people, all of a sudden, it's not part of the housing burden, it's probably the housing answer. You're retrofitting homes, and the scale of that is massive. So there is a lot we can do that we don't because we have, an unusual, unfounded perception of risk. Most of the time, that's solved by taking someone in a community and saying, well, look, that's a geothermal system. You're digging a hole in the ground, putting pipes in, and it's a water furnace. It's not really complicated, but somehow it's thought of as complicated. So there's kind of getting through this risk perception, which drives me bonkers most days because the risks are actually quite low and the investments return quite well. If we only think of it as one thing as an investment, then we won't draw in the rest of the ecosystem. And we need to draw it in alongside FCC. The other thing is government capital needs to think differently. I'm not saying there's a lot of government capital that goes into programs. I spent 10 years, I did a sentence with the feds for 10 years at senior levels inside the federal government. Good people. The problem is they're trying to solve a problem of which they have no contact point with. They're not on the ground, so they're not going to actually know how to solve the problem. People in community do, though. So if you actually go talk to them, they'll go, well, I know we need that, but what we need to really do that is to do this first. And so the money needs to show up in the right way, which it often doesn't, with lots of tick boxes and things that you need to do. my desire as government just says, I want to pay for a better outcome, more food production. We've got a type 2 diabetes investment. Obviously, at the core of that is a food problem. There's a psychological problem, there's a health problem around it, but there's also a food problem. So the invitation is, let's go to community and actually invest in the things that work for them because they know, empower them to do it. You get resilience, you get better investments, you get returns that live longer and longer.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with everyone, and I think it's really important when you build new technology to put a food system more sustainable, you need to have a profitability business. You cannot depend on grant and stuff like that, that's for sure. The only thing I would add is there's a lot of barriers in our field because you're working with live organisms, food security, so you'll have a lot of regulation. You know, you're playing with food safety. So you cannot expect those technologies to develop as fast as, you know, the Silicon Valley typical tech. So you need a different lens, and that's where if you've got more people coming around in terms of money structure, that's really important because you cannot just expect the same result in the agriculture business than in any tech because it's going to be really capital intensive, take longer. As Justine mentioned, we're living a lot with that. You've got one season. So, well, when you do your trial, if it rained all this summer, well, you need to wait another year. And when you're operating a facility that's burning a lot of money, that's, you know, just as perspective, we need to keep in mind that agriculture needs times and you need to do it right so to keep the food safety.
Thanks so much. Great perspectives, everyone. So we have some time for a Q&A from the audience. I believe we have a couple of roving mics. Great. And I can't see that.
I can't see.
I can see sort of. Okay, there's a over there on the right-hand side, midway back. Yeah.
So thank you all so much. My question is around any advice or best practices you've seen around frameworks or approaches for directly engaging some of these communities. You've spoken to it, the importance of it, especially farming communities. What have you seen in terms of that direct community buy-in and input and how you can engage in those relationships equitably?
So call me anytime if you want to get some of that direct access. I would also add, I mean, I know Allison has a network. The associations could be a good way to access it. There's also a really interesting smart farm network in Canada. There's one in Alberta, Manitoba, and I think through that, there's communities that come together to test different technologies. So I think if you look a little bit across the ecosystem, there's a few of us that touch many. And we're very willing, quite frankly, to share what we know, right? Better understand what you're trying to do to then, I'll say, make it worth the farmer's time, meaning send you to the right place so that you can have that engagement is what I would respond. I don't know if Allison has.
So there's a really good report that an expert panel put out recently, and it's called The Next Course. Have a look at that. The fund that I've built, which is sector specific, is investing in technologies, diverse founders that are looking at technologies across the space. We will release our first impact report, and I would love anyone to take a look at it. We're one of the first early stage agricultural funds that is focusing on impact, and we're also driving for financial return. And our fund wants to return at least 5 times, which is well beyond what venture capital currently returns today, plus impact. And we have taken a very disciplined approach for impact. We're using IRIS metrics. We have linked to planetary boundaries. And we have taken various sectors within the ag industry to take a look at what kind of impact will new technologies bring to bear. And so I've put us out there, bet on it. Thankfully, FCC has bet on us, and several banks in Canada, as well as some independent investors. So if you would like to see how we've done, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to send you the first impact report.
Can I just? Yeah, because it's interesting what I heard on the panels is kind of my approach to this, or my response to your question is, look for intermediaries, people who have relationships on the ground who are doing the work. That's what Allison's fund is doing. That's what our fund does. So we have relationships in communities. We spend a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears building these relationships, and it avoids tripping on things that are already being done. It also lets you kind of take a strength-based approach. What's actually working already? Where can we double down on that to kind of build things in? And I think, like Allison, the way we look at it, it's all about impact first. We're all over impact, which we refer to as getting better outcomes for humanity and for Indigenous people. Like, this is where we want to go with everything that we do too. So I look for the intermediaries, people who know. So if I wanted to do ag investing, I'd probably call up Allison, and then I'd call, and then start, okay, let's look around for who's doing the work on the ground.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Yes, at the back on the left there. Thanks for waiting for the mic.
Hello.
Perfect.
Thank you. We have a new Prime Minister who mentioned that we have a budget for operations and a budget for investment, let's say infrastructure. My questions to you is that if you had to pitch to our new Prime Minister for an infrastructure investment that will serve climate change adaptation, resilience for sustainable communities, what would it be? I know it's hard, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So you want our panelists to pitch to the Prime Minister. I don't think he's in this room, unfortunately. Maybe next year.
I intend to pitch to the Prime Minister, which is why I'm going to choose to this. I mean, we're engaging government all the time because we want government money to show up better, differently, and to actually, my pitch would be, I just want you to buy better outcomes by trusting that the communities know what they're doing and that we know what we're doing with the communities. So I want you to get long-term systemic savings by investing upfront and really closely watching the evidence and the data with us. So get out of the business of thinking that you know how to do it and trust the people who do know how to do it. That's the pitch. Take work off the books, decrease your operational budget. It's a little bit of economist math. Decrease the operational budget, increase the investment budget, and over time you will greatly decrease the operational budget over the long term through environment savings, less costs out, creating jobs, you name it. And we can show it now. Like, we have whole cards where we can do rate cards on what's saved and what's earned.
So my pitch will be make Canada investor friendly. There are many ways that you can incentivize people to bring capital to Canada that's invested in Canadian entrepreneurs. And also, let's unlock some of the capital that sits on the side of the fence in Canada. Let's make sure we have incentives, tax credit incentives. Let's make sure that we have, if you invest, business expenditures on research and development. Let's increase our economic activity. And the final thing, we have had years and years and years of innovation agendas. Let's just start acting. I want a bias for action, and I was very disappointed with the CSA. Anything when we take ESG and DEI off the agenda, I've got to question, what are we thinking? We don't need a new word for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're pretty good words. Let's start investing in the things that make us a much stronger country.
And maybe what I would pitch is I would say, Mr. Prime Minister, before you jump to infrastructure, what you first need is a strategy. So I think everybody, what we're talking about is the execution of a strategy, which includes what are you going to offer as incentive? How do you bring in new investors to the table? How do you think differently in terms of how you would do it? One of the fundamental problems or challenges we have in Canada is we don't have a strategy. So this is how these different programs get created. They're short-term in nature, and we're not able to kind of reach the long-term impact that we're trying to have. And then in terms of the reduction in operational expenses, I would want to see if the Prime Minister would be willing to talk to say, you might have the tools in your toolkit. Those tools, though, haven't been incentive to work together. They've been incentive to work in their own silos. And if you just made the effort to encourage that connectivity, we could unlock quite a bit. So I'm a believer that it's not starting from scratch, but you got to first take a look at what's in front of you, recognize what levers you need to pull, be really crisp about them, but you need a plan, and the plan needs to involve several actors and incentivize them to come to the table and work together.
Right, there's the pitches. Any other questions from the audience? We have time for one or two more before we need to wrap.
Maybe we could give an example while we wait for a question.
Yeah?
Maybe we could give an example. Do you know how big Holland's industry is? Do you think Canada's an agricultural superpower? Let's start there. How many of you think that? Oh my goodness.
Darlene, you have to live your hand up. You work for FCC.
Okay. The Netherlands has been the world's second largest exporter of agribusiness goods for time immemorial. Brazil is now taking over. Where does Canada sit? We sit at 8 and we're dropping to 11. If you want to know the size of Holland, it could fit between Brooks. It could fit right inside Nova Scotia, our second smallest province. We have so many advantages. We do not process or create value-added goods. We need to invest there. So back to the infrastructure, invest in those things. AI, we were the leaders. University of Toronto, University of Montreal, University of Alberta, we created the research engines that are AI. We don't adapt our own technology. So there's so many things that we could be doing, advanced manufacturing. It would just change the way Canada is economically driven.
So maybe to just quickly add on the AI piece, because we didn't bring up AI. I'll give an example to the audience. So about 2 years ago at FCC, we kind of decided to redo our strategy, and we anchored it on 3 things. Being bold, so what are we going to do differently than we've done before? Being a catalyst, so bring people together, and building for long-term resilience. Investing in the ag tech space and funding innovation was one of the key takeaways. So we challenged ourselves that in the next 5 years, we would deploy about $1 billion into that space. We're just finished the first year of being in that space. We've deployed about $170 million, and we are becoming one of the top investors in AI in agriculture in all of Canada. And I'm actually not proud of it. Why? Because if it's only FCC that's there, it really gives you an indication of what that imperative is. And to Allison's point, we've got some of the best universities in the world in Canada on AI knowledge and teaching, and all of that knowledge is leaving our country and going elsewhere. So those are some of the imperatives and the opportunities. And to your point is that there is opportunity to make money, but there's also that opportunity to be able to tell the Canadian story in a much different way than we have before.
You both just spoke to what I was going to ask as my last question, which is essentially, what does success look like? How will we know when we've more successfully built more resilient communities and a more resilient agriculture sector? It's a real challenge in adaptation because you don't have that clear, measurable goal in quite the same way that you do with reducing emissions. We all know net zero is a target by a certain date. It gets much more amorphous and tricky to measure when you're talking about building resilience in communities and in sectors of our economy. I don't know if either of you want to add anything to what you just said about a vision for what success looks like, or open it up to Jeff and Cedric. We have a couple of minutes before we wrap.
I'd like to follow on that conversation because agriculture and its technologies come from every sphere. You don't get it from an ag university. You go to space. You go to matter. You go to quantum. all of the innovations that can be applied on farm, in new processing spaces. It's so exciting. What I want you to understand how big the agricultural market is, this is the investment space. This is where you should be investing dollars. And at the same time, you might be changing food security, which is what you talked about.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit into it. It's hard to think, what does real success look like? A whole bunch of innovative financial instruments are at play, being used by a wide variety of financial institutions, not only catalyzed by, proactive government thinkers, but, a Royal Bank says, we got to invest in these Indigenous communities because this will lead the economic resurgence of Canada. They're on the front line, control of lands, really important things coming out of Indigenous communities. The second half of that is where, what I didn't get into in this panel at all was, Indigenous people have been for many thousands of generations on the front lines of living with Mother Earth and watching it and understanding it and learning to live it and learning to live and learn from the earth, which is where we spent our time. And exporting that way, that philosophy, beyond Canada so that we take better care of the planet generally and we start thinking about economic structures differently so that we're not putting things at risk, because we put things at risk and the economy has largely driven it. So we need to, I'm back to the Prime Minister pitch, unfortunately, but I think we need to rebuild the economy with a different vision behind it. And it's not a vision that says I need to push back against a sort of colonial United States, but a vision says that we need to build on the Canadian people, the Indigenous people in this country, and build a different way of having better outcomes for all our people. And I think the economy that we've inherited to now is, basically came out of Holland, actually speaking of, the first corporation out of the Netherlands in the 1600s. It's a colonial economy. We've inherited a colonial economy, and we can easily remake the economy. I encourage government actors and I encourage financial actors to think differently about it. And I'm probably a weird person than some of the others in the room, where I cheered the closing down of Hudson Bay Company. I thought it was time for that institution to be over. It wasn't a good retail store anyways in the last 80 years, but that's a whole different thing. But it represented something of a past economy that was very extractive. And we don't need to be extractive, we need to be additive to the economy, which is what we're talking about in intellectual property and stuff built out of universities and how we invest and doing things differently. So I went on a total rant there at the end of this, but
it's a good rant.
It's just a way of taking this.
It's a good rant.
Thank you.
So my pitch to all of you, if you take a look at the ag and food space, from a Canadian perspective, it's an industry that's outperformed many of the other industries in Canada, 7 out of the last 10 years, so it does know how to perform. From an Indigenous perspective, there's a $1.5 billion GDP to go and get in terms of what it can contribute to the overall economy. So it's not peanuts at all. But from an ag and food perspective, I want you to think about this. Canada has what we call a generational opportunity. So this is an opportunity that we haven't seen in this country for generations. And we can actually, with this industry, solve 4 major global problems: health, hunger, climate, and be a huge driver of economic growth. And this industry can do it not just individually, it can do that all at once. So as you're thinking of your investments in terms of resiliency, adaptability, how to be inclusive, how to bring that to the table, those are the problems that we're positioning Canada to be able to solve with this. And that's why it matters.
Perfect. And Cedric, I'm going to give you a chance, but we actually have somebody from the audience who wanted to get in with a question, and I wanted to give them a chance before we wrap up.
Hello, okay. Hello, Cedric. Hello, Justine. My name is Sébastien Anger. I'm a farmer and agronomist, specialized in regenerative agriculture, so I know the subject really deep. My question is, when I see some my neighbor farmers try to buying a new land,
Yes.
and bidding always the best big price, and get the power from the bank, usually, okay? But with my experience, more the price is, the land is high, more we put pressure on the nature. More pressure you put, the nature capital will we build more low,
Oui.
we lose. And why the bank have no matrix of soil health when they give some loan to the farmers? That's my big question.
Thank you.
Do we have another 2 hours to solve?
Yeah, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. Let me try to answer very quickly 2 things. One, what I hear in your question is actually recognizing those that do take care of the soil and probably giving more credit to those individuals from a risk profile than others that won't. So that's what I hear in your question in terms of financiers. The shift in thinking we have to do is to actually recognize those that contribute to biodiversity, contribute to using adaptability or regenerative agriculture, you name it, and giving them that honest credit, whether it looks like a reduced interest rate or easier access to capital. I would suggest that's one of the ways that we need to start to think differently than we do today, but happy to continue that conversation afterwards.
Thanks for that. Cedric, you get the last word of the panel, which seems appropriate since everything is about you.
Yeah, sure. Just to wrap up your question about what success is, I would say, because we're talking about system change and big terms and a lot of work. I would say, in my terms, success is what is just taking the first step. Because most of the time we're trying to change everything, but the only way there's no one solution to everything. So, Sébastien that just talked, he's taking care of his farm. That's the first step. That's success. So it's really doing that. At Ento System is every day that there's a truck, the driver tell me, well, if you're not taking that truck, I'm going to landfill. So every day is removing food waste from some landfill. And I would say that's success. Celebrating the small victory is important.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. If we want to maybe give a round of applause to our panelists, appreciate it. Thank you.